The Grave by David Hicks. I've always enjoyed exploring old graveyards and cemeteries. I find the gravestones interesting and artistic, and as I look at the name on the gravestones, I often wonder, what were the lives like of the people buried there? Sometimes you can research the names and get an insight into the times and culture that these people experienced. I especially enjoy exploring small, private family cemeteries located in out-of-the-way places. The stories behind these gravesites can prove fascinating. I lived for 2 years in a new housing subdivision in Hendersonville, Tennessee that had been built on what had been a family farm in the 1800s. Across the street from my home was a small family plot of several graves dating back to the mid-1860s, right after the end of the Civil War. There appeared to be a woman and her 2 teen daughters buried in this small plot. The gravesite was in a state of disrepair. It was being mowed regularly by the neighbors on either side of the small plot, but the tombstones were falling over, weeds were growing next to the gravestones as they leaned almost to the ground, and this just seemed wrong to me, even disrespectful. These women deserved to have gravesites that were maintained and in good repair. I kept watch to see if I could catch the neighbors outside in hopes of engaging them in conversation and explaining that I planned to clean up the site and set the gravestones up right. I watched for weeks but never seemed to get an opportunity to meet them. I finally decided I would just get up early on a Sunday morning and fix the tombstones. I got some dirt and gravel to keep the tombstones from falling over again. I also purchased some large concrete planters to place in front of the graves. I planned to plant some flowers in the planters. Hopefully, they'd come up and bloom every spring. I also picked up some cut flowers for the graves so the planters would look nice until the flowers grew. I gathered my supplies at about 6 a.m. on Sunday morning, walked across the street, and began the job of resetting the gravestones. I had to gently remove the heavy stones and slide them out of the way so I could dig down into the hole they'd been sitting in. The holes had become too shallow to keep the gravestones upright, and I needed to dig down about 1.5 feet. After digging out the holes a bit, I could slide the stones back in place, add some dirt and then some gravel to fill the hole in a way to make sure that the stones would remain standing. I had finished the second grave when I noticed a woman standing in the driveway of one of the houses adjacent to the small plot. She was watching me and smiling, and I admit her presence did startle me a bit. She looked to be in her mid to late 30s with long brown hair that fell below her shoulders. She had a beautiful smile and her green eyes. Wow, they just shined so brightly. When I made eye contact, her eyes seemed kind, but I noticed a mischievous sparkle that matched her smile. She was in a long nightgown with a very nice robe over it, so I assumed she had come out to get her paper. I introduced myself and explained that I was just doing some maintenance to the graves because it seemed a shame they'd fallen into such a state of disrepair. She introduced herself as Emily, and we exchanged pleasantries. She had a beautiful southern accent. She was very attractive, but when I glanced at her left hand, I saw a wedding ring. She asked me why I'd chosen to do this, as it seemed to be a lot of work for somebody to do, especially on a Sunday morning. I replied I just thought it was the thing to do. These graves should be tended to and maintained. The ladies deserve to have some respect shown to their final resting place. The graves just seemed to feel lonely and neglected here in the forgotten plot. She asked about the large stone planting pots I had. I explained that I planned to plant some flowers in them with the hope that they'd come up every spring. I also showed her the cut flowers I purchased as a gift so that the ladies would know that someone remembered them and had come by to visit. She commented that it seemed a chivalrous thing to do and that she thought it was a kind, sweet gesture that would definitely be appreciated. She said her goodbyes and turned to leave, and I said it had been nice to meet her. I hoped to see her again. She turned and smiled and said, "That would be nice." I finished with the last tombstone, set up the planters and planted some seeds. Then I laid the cut flowers on top of the planters. As I laid each bunch of the cut flowers, I told the ladies that I would do my best to keep their graves maintained and bring flowers as often as I could. I said that while I lived there, they would not be forgotten and that I cared about them. For the rest of the time I lived there, I brought fresh cut flowers every week to their graves, and I spent a moment talking to them. Periodically, I'd see Emily, my neighbor, outside, and she would always smile and wave, but I never got the opportunity to talk to her again. About 2 years later, I moved away, and before I moved, I had a garage sale to get rid of some of the junk that I tended to accumulate wherever I lived. I'd marked everything really low, so it was selling fast. I saw a couple come out of Emily's front door across the street and walk over. They introduced themselves, and I asked if they were friends with Emily. Who? They asked. They said they didn't know an Emily. I told them I thought that a woman named Emily lived in that house. They were looking at me rather oddly and said no, they'd lived there for several years. I asked them if they knew any of the neighbors on either side of them, and they said yes, the woman was the head of the HOA and knew pretty much everyone in the neighborhood. I described Emily, and they informed me that no one on that street fit my description or that name. Well, at this point, they were looking at me like I was insane, so I said I must have been mistaken, apologized, sold them a lamp and table I no longer needed, and they left with their purchase. I could sense their relief at getting away from someone that they thought must have been crazy. My mind began churning, trying to explain why they didn't know Emily. I quickly became too busy selling everything I wanted to get rid of to think about it much. One of the last people to show up owned a thrift store. I gave him a great deal on everything remaining just to get rid of it and finish. My things had been packed and moved, so all I had to do was some cleaning up, and I was ready to leave. As I walked to my car, it was turning dark, and I saw the graves across the street. It was fall, and it was raining lightly. The temperature was cooling off rapidly, and that caused some little wisps of mist to form along the ground. Earlier that morning, I'd brought large bouquets of red roses for each of the ladies and said my goodbyes. Before I left, I looked at the graves and felt a pull, so I walked over for one last time. There was some trash laying on one of the planters, so I kneeled down to remove it. As I was about to get up, I noticed the name again. It was the mother's grave, and her first name was Emily. When I saw that, my heart started to race, and my head began to spin. The hairs on my arms even stood up, and I looked around, checking to see if someone were watching me. I stared for a moment and finally decided to just leave as the rain was starting to come down harder. I walked quickly back to my automobile, got in, started the engine, and turned on the heater because I was feeling a definite chill. I had goosebumps on my arms. I took a moment to breathe and calm down before I backed out of the driveway. Then I put it in gear and started to drive away. I'd gone only about 100 meters when I glanced into the rearview mirror. What I saw startled me. At first, I was frightened. Standing there in the rain was Emily and two younger women. I stopped the car and jumped out. The rain was starting to come down harder now, and the mists were rising, starting to obscure them. I looked at Emily, and she was smiling and waving along with the other two young women. When I made eye contact with her beautiful green eyes, my fear left, and I saw her mouth the words, "Goodbye and thank you." The rain started coming down in torrents, and when it let up, I could see again, and they were gone.